So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Dogen. I'm Hoko. I'm the Vice Abbot here at Sanshin Zen Community. I hope everyone picked up the opening and closing chants, either from the chat here or from the website. It suddenly occurred to me last night, since we've taken this thing entirely virtual, folks may not have those. So if you didn't know what was going on this morning, please look for those chants either on the website or in the chat. So this is the second time we've done an intro Dogen retreat at Sanshin. It's the first time that I've been the one who's leading it. The first time that we did this was a couple of years ago with Hojo-san. I had asked him to do an intro Dogen something. I asked him several times and he just kept laughing at me. So it took a little bit of convincing to get this thing started. Took a couple tries. If you attended that retreat, then you've seen already from the materials that I'm going to do this a little bit differently than he did. Hojo-san covered a few things deeply. I am covering a whole lot and broadly. He did 3 lectures, I'm doing 5. And shortly after that retreat with Hojo-san, we shut down for the pandemic. This time we're shut down for the winter weather. I'm starting to associate Intro Dogen with acts of nature. I don't know. We'll see what happens next year. So, and of course, this time we're virtual. And a couple of years ago, nobody even dreamed about doing something like this virtually. So the winter weather has arrived as we anticipated. It is still snowing even as we speak. As of last night, everything was closed. Schools, government offices, stores, travel was on an emergency only basis. So no trash pickup, no buses running. Hoshin was telling me last night the roads were incredibly bad. It seems that the decision we took to move this thing entirely online was the right call, so that just everybody stays safe. So you're around for the next few days. So for now, at least, we're in my house. Welcome to my house. This is the space I used to lead practice during the pandemic shutdown. So we may occasionally be visited by cats. So if you see Gus and Ray and Tails wandering by, they are participating in their own feline way in our weekend. So Hoshin's going to be ringing bells from his place before the first lecture and into the first lecture, and then second lecture, and after I'll take the middle part. So we're going to split that piece of the leadership between us today. So I just need to say there have been some power outages, mostly at this point to the south of me, but if I suddenly disappear, just know I will do my best to recover quickly, get back at least by the next lecture. I'm hoping ice-covered branches don't go down on power lines here, but if so, just know that's what's going on. Hoshin can continue to manage the Zazen schedule. You can continue to practice. Please don't, give up. Please continue to practice, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you for your patience about that. Okay, so a little bit about what we're going to be doing over the next couple of days. The point of these 5 lectures is to give you some context, give you the context that you need to start or to continue your study of Dogen's teachings and writings and practice. This is not Genzo-e. We will not be taking one fascicle, the Shobo Genzo, and taking it apart. Instead, we're going to look at everything surrounding Dogen's practice and writings so we can organize our thinking. And so we know what elements are related to what other elements when we look at what he was teaching and writing. So I'm a pattern thinker by temperament. My experiences of the world is intersections and connections, right? So this thing comes from this thing, or this thing is connected to this thing, related to this thing. So my approach as a Dharma teacher tends to be that I build the things that I wish I'd had, right? I build or create or put together all the stuff that I wish I'd had. So this is the retreat that I wish I'd had when I was getting started and trying to make sense of what Dogen was teaching and writing. So what I'm sharing with you are the things that I find helpful, the context that I find helpful, and the resources that have been helpful for me. So it might be tempting to say, well, who cares what order Dogen wrote stuff in, or who cares what Pure Land Buddhism or Japanese literature was doing at the time that Dogen was alive or practicing or writing. Let's just get to the juicy stuff about Buddha nature and studying the self and how time flows backwards and, all the things that we hear about Dogen. That's all well and good, but Dogen's writings are very much a product of their time and place. So, yes, there is a universal element to what he is teaching, If that was not there, then what he wrote, what he taught, wouldn't mean anything to us. So certainly, there is something universal about that. But without some understanding of the things that shape what he says, influence what he's talking about, why he's saying certain things, why he's emphasizing certain things, we are prone to making some pretty big misinterpretations and coming to some pretty big misunderstandings because we just don't have the whole picture. And in some ways, it was quite different than what we're doing today. Also, we need to know his story has been very intentionally curated and crafted by, over time, by people who had a particular agenda. They needed him to be seen a certain way. They needed the denomination to be seen a certain way. So what we have received about him and what we think we know about him bears some investigating, right? Some assumptions have been made and some stories have been told, and that's fine, but we need to know that that's what's going on. So over the course of the weekend, we're going to look at 4 things. We're going to look at Dogen's life and times, what's happening just before he's born, what's happening while he's alive, what happens after he dies, because the story goes on after he dies. We will look at literary forms and linguistic devices that he uses, things that were common enough in medieval Asian literature, things that he's picked up that show up in his writing, as well as what he wrote, when he wrote that, and why that's important. We will look at the major themes of his teachings and writings. There's about 8, 9, 10 of them that show up repeatedly that we can start to see the patterns about. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the world of Dogen studies as it is today and how we can fruitfully, meaningfully approach teachings, writings, how we practice with these things. So that's kind of our roadmap for this weekend. So I've categorized the content in this way, but really all of these things are fairly closely intertwined. So it may feel like we're hopping back and forth a little bit. We're introducing something here, we're talking about it there, it comes up again over here. That's kind of the nature of it. I think you will quickly see that the arc of that story, the elements of that story are tied together. So we're going back and forth a little bit, but all the pieces really kind of fit together. When you put all of those pieces together, then when you read one of Dogen's texts, it's not going to feel random. It's not going to feel disconnected or like you're floating out there somewhere, right, without a lifeline. You'll start to recognize the elements that give you a foothold. Oh, there's that thing again. Oh, there's that form again. Oh, here's that theme. Yeah, we've already encountered that. So you start to see how everything sort of hangs together. So I encourage you to make connections between one topic and another topic. As things come past you this weekend, if you're taking notes, you might set some pointers within your notes when you make a connection. Oh, here's that thing that we talked about yesterday. Here's how these things are connected. One piece of content and another piece of content might actually help you get to some clarity about whatever that topic is. I know for myself, speaking from my own experience, I'd go to Genzo-e, I'd take notes like crazy. Everything Hojo-san made perfect sense to me, wrote it all down. Look at those notes 6 months later and it's completely opaque. Somehow the understanding has already left. So, make the connections, point yourself back to how you got to the things that you understand, because my hope is you're using those notes when you're reading Dogen or doing some Dogen study. So I hope the things that come out of this weekend are useful to you going forward. So there's a boatload of material to get through this weekend. Hold on to your hats. There's a lot coming at you. There is a tremendous lot of ground to cover. We're going to have to do some of it fairly superficially because our time is limited together. So we don't have time, unfortunately, to go down every rabbit hole and to chase down every passing reference. So I encourage you to keep a parking lot list. If I mention a term, a person, an event, something that's unfamiliar to you, stick that in the parking lot because you may want to go later and investigate that some more. I may not have time to fully explain or answer your questions about that, and I may ask you, please investigate that on your own. So make a list, make notes, keep track of the things that you'd like to look up. There is time for questions at the end of each of these talks, but we're going to be moving rapidly enough that you may not remember your question an hour after it occurs to you. So you may want to make a note of your question just so we make sure we get to those things and you have time to ask them at the end. Let me also say, because we're all virtual today, If you miss a word, if you don't know how to spell something and you want to ask in the chat, and there's somebody else here who knows that name, knows that term, can give you that information, go ahead and make use of that. I don't have a whiteboard at home. I can't write things down, but help each other out, absolutely. You know, there's something you missed, there's a word you didn't catch, something you don't know how to spell, it's a foreign word, and somebody can help you. Absolutely go ahead and do that. So make notes about the things you want to investigate on your own. This weekend is a starting point, right? My hope is this weekend is a springboard for you in your continuing study. I'm hoping it's going to point you toward what things you'd like to learn more about from here. I have to say, I don't consider myself an expert on Dogen by any means. As I say, I'm sharing with you the things that have been helpful to me. So I am certainly drawing on the leadership and scholarship of other teachers, other academics. That's what I'm using to support my own teaching and practice. So I hope these things are helpful for you. I have to say, my Japanese isn't good enough to read the primary source material. That's a serious limitation because of the way language is used, as we will see going forward. So my hope is younger teachers, younger scholars are coming up who are going to fully, thoroughly educate themselves and can help us sort of carry things forward into the future. So at the age of 60, I'm doing the best I can. And I'm hopeful that there's some of you out there or some younger folks coming up who are going to pick this up and carry it forward. Okay, so let's do something about Dogen here. So in order to understand Dogen's writings, we need to understand his life and times, and that's where we're going to begin. So what was he experiencing in his own life, the background of what was happening in Japan, what was happening in Buddhism more particularly. We also need to look at our perception about who Dogen was and where that perception comes from, because those perceptions color how we read what he wrote and what he's teaching. As I say, the Dogen story was constructed quite intentionally by people with agendas, you know, long after he died in some cases. So let's look at what's happening in Kamakura, Japan. So we know Dogen lived from 1200 to 1253. So this is the time period in which he lived. He lived during a period of Japanese history known as the Kamakura Jidai, or the Kamakura period, which goes from 1185 to 1333. So that's the time period we're looking at. So Kamakura is a city about 30 miles from Tokyo. And this period is named for that city because it was the headquarters of the most powerful clan at that time, the Minamotos. So the two main sets of players here are the Minamotos and the Fujiwaras. So these are the two families, the two clans that make up the important part of this story. So there is an emperor, there is an imperial court. They are important. They are considered divine, actually. But these two clans are competing for power. So the Fujiwaras are court bureaucrats. The Minamotos are military. I'm simplifying this clearly quite a bit. So just at the time that Dogen is born, Japanese society is really undergoing quite a radical transformation. It's moving from 4 centuries of peaceful rule by the Fujiwara aristocracy, including the emperor, to the dominance of a warrior class, including the shogun. So the military, the warrior class, the shoguns are rising at this point. So there are two opposing social forces. We've got the court nobility in Kyoto, and we've got the military class in Kamakura, and Kyoto and Kamakura are about 270 miles apart, right? So you may have noticed, by the way, we didn't talk about handouts, and I should quickly say, I hope everybody's got the handouts. There's a general outline, and on the back of that general outline, there's a map, and you may want to have a look at the map and follow along with where people are moving and where Dogen is living. So just quickly, in addition to the general outline, you should also have something called Dogen's Canon, which talks about all the things that he wrote. There is also a summary of the fascicles of the Shobogenzo, quick summary so that you have that just to use for your reference. There's a piece called Example. It's on exercises, which we may or may not have time to get to. And there is a timeline, a context timeline, which you could also use to follow along with the things we're talking about at this point. So should have done that before. Glad we're doing it now. So of course, this is posted on the website. Everybody can download that. All right, so overall governance at this point is by the Kamakura shogunate, which is officially established in 1192 by the first shogun. His name is Minamoto no Yoritomo, so he's a Minamoto. He's part of this family. A shogun is a military dictator, right? That's what that role is all about. This is the first time there's been any alternative to the imperial court. So for all this time, you know, leadership, rulership has come from the imperial court, the aristocracy. Now we have a rising military class, warrior class, and now the shoguns are challenging in some ways this long-term government. So Minamoto consolidates his power. He establishes a new government at his family home in Kamakura, and he calls this government a bakufu. Literally means tent government. So you can imagine the military is out in the field, you know, doing what the military does. They're living in tents, and so the term comes from this. So this is the bakufu is a tent government. It sounds pretty humble, right? Living in tents, you know, being outside doesn't sound terribly aristocratic, terribly elite. But in return for military protection, the emperor gives him an ancient and important title, Sei Tai Shogun. So there's where the shogun comes from. So we call his government a shogunate, and we call Minamoto a shogun. So that's what's going on with that. So technically the emperor is still higher than the shogun, but the reality is that who's ever in control of the military is in charge. So if you have a rising military class, of course, there's a rising amount of power there, which is a direct challenge to the emperor and to the aristocracy. So the emperor still has a ceremonial function. The shogun still wants his endorsement in order to maintain legitimacy. So, you know, emperor is still functioning in certain ways, and these two things are figuring out like how to coexist. So the old court is residing in Kyoto. It's holding on to its land. It's trying desperately to hold on to its power as well. But some newly organized military families are going over to the shogunate. So, like, where is your loyalty going to be? Depending on where you are in society and what family you are part of, kind of influences where you think the power is. So even though these families are sort of gravitating toward the shogunate, Minamoto can't hold on to the leadership of his family in the long term. There's some conflict internally in the family for a long time. Even though Minamoto has done away with his most serious opponents, his relatives, he just, you know, gets them out of the way if he needs to do that. Then he dies suddenly in a riding accident in 1199. So this is the year before Dogen is born. Suddenly, shogun dies. He's only been in power for 7 years. His son, Minamoto no Yorii, becomes shogun and the nominal head of the Minamoto family. But this is only after a lot of infighting, a lot of power struggling. So this is not a stable time. There's a lot of social upheaval going on here. So this new shogun, his mother and his grandfather, who come from the Hojo clan, want to take over the power, the leadership for themselves. So they establish a regency for this young shogun. And the mother and the grandfather are sort of ruling in his place or ruling in his name. So the shogun becomes a kind of a powerless figurehead. This is not the person who's actually wielding power. He's got people around him who are doing that kind of on his behalf. So his mother had gone to a convent when his father died, but somehow she stays involved with politics. She's not hiding in the convent. She's still very much involved with wielding power. So eventually, this woman, his mother, and her father, shogun's grandfather, have a disagreement. She exiles the grandfather. So now she's the only one kind of still around. So she works for having Yorii's brother Sanetomo become the shogun. So there's a shift. Who is the shogun? It's another brother still under this regency. This other brother rules for 16 years until he's assassinated by his nephew, and the nephew is in turn assassinated, and then the Yoritomo line of the Minamoto clan goes extinct. Only the Hojos are left within the shogunate. So you can see this is not a peaceful time. And we'll see in a little bit why, you know, this is contributing to just unsettledness, right? Just social unsettledness, because all of this is going on. So again, quick summary, Yoritomo becomes the shogun for 7 years. He dies in an accident. Each of his 2 sons, Yorii and Sanetomo, become shogun in turn. Yorii's son kills Sanetomo, then he's killed, that line goes away, and the reason we care about the Minamotos is that Dogen is related to them. So this is not something happening outside of his sort of existence, right? This is part of his family that all of this is going on with. So in 1222, the emperor tries to take advantage of the fact that these Minamotos are falling apart as shoguns, and emperor launches a coup. So this is what we call the Jokey War. Emperor is trying to regain control of the government. He's using everything he can, including the monk armies of Mount Hiei. We don't often think about monks making up armies, but Mount Hiei has its own kind of monk armies. Other sects, other temples are participating as well. So the Hojo forces easily defeat the emperor. They easily win. They execute some of the court officials involved in this plot. Some of them are related to Dogen's family. The emperor is exiled, and he spends the rest of his life off someplace writing poetry, living a quiet, sort of peaceful life. So the imperial court is now under control of the shogunate, although the court keeps its estates, it keeps its land holdings, it keeps its wealth, but it doesn't really have the power. It's the shogunate that has now risen to the top. So there's a real shift in society from leadership and culture of the imperial court, the aesthetics of the imperial court, the refinement of all of that, toward military leadership. But the Kamakura period ends about 110 years later in 1333, and the shogunate goes away. So for a brief time, the emperor is reestablished, but we can see how power is going back and forth, shifting, back and forth. So in this court, I should say, up to this point, the aristocracy, the court part of this society, has mainly been spending its time on politics and arts. So there's a lot of refinement, right? It could afford to do this because it holds an enormous number of tax-free estates. So its wealth is in land. It's in these estates. It's not paying any taxes on these things. It's just accumulating more and more and more wealth. So court has plenty of time to meddle in the politics and deal with the politics and to engage in arts. So it's doing painting, it's doing poetry, right? It's very highly involved with the aesthetic sort of climate of the time. So there are two aesthetics that are important in court life. One is mono no aware, which we'll talk about when we get a little closer into aesthetics that affect Dogen's writing. But in general, it's this sense of the affective quality of life in the world. There's a little bit of, poignancy, right, in life in the world. The other one is mujo, or impermanence, which is really familiar to us, right? So together, these two things create a sense that things are beautiful because of the sorrow that goes with the fact that they are impermanent. So we appreciate things because they are not going to be here a long time. Although that brings up some feeling of sorrow and poignancy, there's some beauty in that, right? And we appreciate that. So we'll be taking a closer look at those things when we get into the section on aesthetics. But to establish that now, that's the feeling that's happening within the court, within the aristocracy. So religion is an important part of court life, but more because of aesthetics than because of ethics, right? So it's not the morality that's drawing people in. So the aristocracy sees religion in the rise and the ultimate fall of beautiful things, or we might say life and death, right? So it sees the beauty of that, and that is a religious experience, right, for these folks. So they're less concerned about morality or ethics because they understood their circumstances to be karma, right? Their situation is the result of karmic circumstance. So they don't feel a whole lot of responsibility for people who aren't as well off as they are. They're not looking at morality and ethics and saying what's the right thing to do, and how does everybody, how do we ease suffering for everybody? They're saying, well, I'm here because my karmic circumstances mean I have a privileged position, so I'm not too worried about morality and ethics. I'm much more concerned about the feeling that I have that arises from the things around me and the transience of things around me. So that's part of that general feeling. So this is the period where feudalism is established, which pretty much means that lords required military service of their vassals, and then these vassals are rewarded with estates of their own. Usually these estates had been confiscated from rival families. So again, as part of this upheaval, land ownership is shifting around. If I'm the lord and you're loyal to me and you perform well in battle, I'm going to confiscate somebody's property and give that to you, and that's kind of a reward. So these estate holders, now these folks have been granted more and more land, more and more estates, they begin to exercise local military rule. So this is the basis of the shogunate government. So it's not that folks are elected, there's no kind of representation. It's like you perform well, you are rewarded with estates, with land, you become more powerful, you become a ruler over your little area of the world, right? So this is how this thing works. So if the lord had a lot of estates, he might turn some of them over to a steward. That steward could be male or female, by the way. And the steward would collect and manage the local taxes, and in turn be entitled to housing and financial support. So there's, a partnership, a transaction happening there. Stewardship was frequently a reward for loyalty, in the same way that handing off these estates was a reward. And the stewards themselves became powerful. They themselves became landowners and administrators for their areas, and there's a certain amount of power that comes from that. So there's a lot of, rising and changing and moving within the social structure at this point. But Kamakura shogunate isn't really a national government. These are times of unrest. Stewards met with a lot of resistance. If you were going around collecting taxes on these estates, people didn't like that. So, there's conflict, right? Folks aren't so happy when the tax collector shows up. Shogunates engaged in warfare against other clans, other leaders. There's infighting in the families are fighting each other. The clans are, fighting over everything. And in spite of all of that, the economic situation is fairly good. So that piece, at least, is fairly good. So trade is going on with China during this period. Everything from gold, mercury, fans, swords, timber, lacquerware coming out of Japan, Chinese silk, brocades, perfume, porcelain, tea, copper coins are coming in. So trade is quite healthy. And as we'll see shortly, China is a very important player. So the fact that there is trade happening, there is shipping happening, there is travel happening is really important. So coinage, I mentioned copper coinage was one of the things coming from China. Coinage is starting to be used more frequently, and also starting to be used more frequently are bills of credit. So there's now a shift a bit in how economics work. It means that people, especially warrior class, samurai, are piling up bad debts. They're spending too much. They're spending more than they've got, because now there's bills of credit. Now there's all these coins floating around. So sometimes they can get themselves into a bit of trouble. So in the rural areas now, agricultural tools are improving. Agricultural techniques are improving, largely by, guess what, looking over at what China is doing. So if there's technology improving in China, if there's agricultural practices improving in China, those things get adopted. In cities, the trade guilds are established. At first, that's so the craftspeople and the traders can get the patronage of a local lord or perhaps a monastery, because the monasteries are starting to have a lot of land too. So the guilds could have anywhere from 10 to 100 workers or companies. Might not be individuals, might be companies, might be families. So the workers become increasingly specialized. They develop very particular skill sets. They learn to do one thing or two things extremely well. So villages start to grow in size because the roads improve, the networks improve, particularly because there are, in effect, two capitals, right? We've got Kyoto, where the Fujiwaras are, and we've got Kamakura, where the Minamotos are. And so there has to be some way to travel, to communicate. So partly on that basis, roads become very good. The road networks become much, much better. So that's the Reader's Digest version of what's going on socially, politically, governmentally, at about the time that Dogen is functioning. So we need also to look then specifically at what's going on in the Buddhist world, what's going on in Kamakura Buddhism. So during the Kamakura, there is what we can call Old Buddhism and New Buddhism. Old Buddhism and New Buddhism. So 6 new sects were established, and those functioned alongside the existing sects. So the old ones didn't go away, but 6 new ones arise. So now there's a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of different sects and schools going on. There's a general shift from what we might think of as traditional Buddhism, that some people had said had just sort of become a collection of magical rites and esoteric practices, and a move toward a religion sort of for the common people, that the average person could engage in, that the average person could understand. Because you can imagine magic rites are esoteric, secret things. The average person, isn't going to engage with that. You have to go to a specialist, if you will, somebody who has particular powers or particular training. So what happens to the common people? So there's a shift toward practices that common people can do, and things that common people can understand. So old Buddhism included Shingon, Tendai, Keigon, Hosso, Sanron, and Ritsu. Now you don't have to memorize these. If you want them again, Shingon, Tendai, Keigon, Hosso, Sanron, and Ritsu, and they continue to thrive. They continue to adapt to changing times. They're already well established, they're already well in place, they don't go away. At the start of the Kamakura, the Mount Hiei monasteries were wealthy and politically powerful, and they appealed primarily to people who were capable of a systematic kind of study of the sect's teachings. So you had to be a bit educated, you had to be a bit smart to go to Mount Hiei and learn systematically what the sect was teaching. So the Shingon sect and the esoteric rituals continue to be fairly popular. They enjoy support largely from noble families in Kyoto. So again, aristocracy. But as we've seen, society is changing. Things are moving around. So political and military conflict, declining aristocracy, rise of the military, rise of the peasant classes, and there's natural disaster happening, right? There's famine and plague and all the things that go with natural disaster, and there's this sort of general social uneasiness. So people attributed this suffering to the arrival of the age of Mappo, right? The decline of the Dharma. So according to Buddhist texts, a period of 500 years after the time of Shakyamuni is the age of the true Dharma, right? So there's teaching, there's practice, there's attaining enlightenment. Everything that can possibly happen, every wonderful thing that can possibly happen is happening for Shakyamuni's time and 500 years after it. Then there's another 500-year period called the Age of Imitation Dharma. So only the forms are left. There's only teaching and practice. Somehow there's no awakening. Then there's the Age of Declining Dharma. This is Mappo, which is the next 500-year period. There's no true practice. There's no awakening. There's only teaching. So many people believe this period of Mappo started in 1052, and they thought it was the cause of the famines, the epidemics, the social unrest, the war that was going on. There was this overall feeling that humanity was kind of in a wretched condition. People were fairly helpless. This was the apocalypse. So, of course, there's a kind of a mass spiritual crisis. So all of this results in the development of new forms of religion. People are looking for, like, what do we do now, right? And what can I personally do as a regular person? So new forms of religion arise. Some of these are indigenous, they're popular or they're folk religion. Some were Buddhist. Some were based on Indian or Chinese influences. There's all kinds of things bubbling, all kinds of things arising because people are looking around for some kind of help, right? Some kind of salvation. So a moment ago, I said that the shogun rewarded his vassals with their own estates, and that means these folks became fairly prosperous and increasingly literate. They're going up the social ladder, right? So they provided more financial support for Buddhist teachers and for Buddhist study. So there's an influx of resources now going to all of these arising sects, teachers and temples and support for study. So that brings us to New Buddhism, right? So during the Kamakura period, 6 new Buddhist schools arise and are established. So Honen founds the Japanese Pure Land School, or the Jodoshu. Shinran founds the Jodo Shinshu sect, and those two are Nembutsu sects. The teaching is we can be born into the Pure Land by faithfully chanting to Amida Buddha. Then there's Eisai, who founded the Rinzai School of Zen, and there's Dogen, who founded what we now think of as the Soto School of Zen. So these two are the Zen sects, emphasizing Zazen, Zen practice. And the last two are Nichiren founded the Nichiren School, and Ippen founded the Jishu branch of Pure Land Buddhism. And these two are the Nichiren sects. So the teaching there is that we can be saved simply by reciting the titles of important sutras. Reciting the title is enough. to get us to the Pure Land, right? So we've got the Nembutsu sects, we've got the Zen sects, and we've got the Nichiren sects, right? So 6 new sects arising. So these are practices that anyone can do. We don't need to understand complicated rituals. We don't need to know anything about secret rites. We don't need to have any kind of special powers. These are things everybody can do. We can all chant to Amida. We can all sit zazen. We can all recite the titles of important sutras. So these things become achievable, right? These things are doable. So we can see in an age of declining Dharma why people are looking for what can I do and why these things arise. So all of these 6 teachers had studied at the Tendai headquarters on Mount Hiei at some point in their lives. So they have this in common, right? They've all had some kind of training and study at Mount Hiei. All of them broke away from Tendai teachings. They all broke away from those institutions when they just couldn't find what they were looking for within that system. They all left to do something else. They had another idea. So first were Honen and Shinran with Pure Land and the New Pure Land. They emphasized belief and practice over formalism, because remember I said one of the concerns about those old schools was it had just become nothing but rites and rituals. So belief and practice over formalism. Because it seemed sort of hopeless to have awakening in this present world of Mappo, some wanted to have rebirth in the Pure Land. They said, it's not going to happen here. It's the age of declining Dharma. There's no awakening here. So my only hope is to be reborn in a Pure Land. So Honen emphasizes chanting the name of Amida Buddha as a means to get there, right? This is a simple practice that anybody could do, so it becomes very, very popular. It's quick, it's easy, we all understand it. So eventually the Tendai establishment feels threatened by this. Tendai establishment pressures the imperial government to expel Honen and Shinran from Kyoto, which it did in 1207. So if you look at your comparative timeline, your context timeline, you can see all of these things kind of happening along that timeline. So that's the 2 of them. Then there's Dogen and Eisai with Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen. So they each traveled to China, not together, separately. When they came back, they started teaching what they learned. So they went to China, learned some things, and really felt strongly that they wanted to come back to Japan and establish what they learned in their home country. So Eisai is older. He goes first and comes back first. He wants to keep his connection with Tendai because he thought Zen could revitalize what's going on in Tendai practice at the time. So in 1194, which is 6 years before Dogen is born, imperial court bans establishment of new Zen temples because the new Zen temples are just starting to appear. Imperial court says no. Things changed in 1200 when the shogunate begins to support Eisai as opposed to the court, right? So again, we have things shifting around. So it's important to know that Dogen didn't think he was establishing any kind of a new sect. And we see this throughout his writings, and we'll touch on this again. He just thought what he was teaching and practicing was essential Buddhism. He didn't think this is tied to any particular school, unlike Eisai, who's coming back to do something called Zen. Dogen just thinks, I'm just doing Buddhism. What I'm doing is the purest form of Buddhism. He doesn't use terms like Zen sect. He doesn't use terms like Soto school. He knew he was doing something different than other Buddhists, but he still saw Buddhism as one thing. He says, Buddhism is one united thing. So, it doesn't make sense to pull it apart and divide it up into different schools and different sects. It's just one unified practice, and what I'm doing is just the practice of Buddhism. So that's the Zen folks. Finally, we have Nichiren, and we have Ippen with the Nichiren school and the Jishu branch of the Pure Land. So these are down-to-earth teachings that are very much rooted in daily concerns of average people. So for Nichiren, that meant not focusing on rebirth in another world or Pure Land, but on liberation in this life through very simple practices. For Ippen, the focus is on reciting Nembutsu and concentrating on practice rather than on some kind of a mental state. So this is very much about here, now, normal people, every day, our average, concerns. So the new Buddhist sects become popular with the government and with the samurai class, and the old Buddhist sects become a bit overshadowed. There's a lot of energy in these new sects that are arising, and they're kind of becoming the visible things. And the old sects, the old practices are starting to become a bit overshadowed. So elements like founder worship and hierarchical systems of head temples and branch temples start to form, and eventually this leads to state-sanctioned, formalized sects. So over time, these things become a bit firmed up, a bit institutionalized. So the rising samurai class fully embraces Zen training methods because of their emphasis on self-control and self-reliance. And you can imagine if you're a military leader or you're working in the military, self-control, self-reliance are really, really important. So they're fully embracing this, but they've got a bit of a conundrum because, you know, the leaders are kind of torn because they know. They're wondering, do I use these skills on the battlefield or not? Because they're quite aware that what they're about is killing people, right? So like, do I use these skills and improve my ability to kill people? So they're wrestling with a kind of an ethical dilemma there, right? So that's bubbling too. So as we mentioned, Zen, of course, had a huge influence on the arts. Aesthetics like wabi, understated beauty, that we'll be talking about in a little bit, influenced the tea ceremony, and the tea ceremony is popular with the aristocratic classes. So again, we see these connections between, you know, religion and aesthetics, and why the court is taking these things up. Painting, calligraphy, pottery, various other arts, of course, intersect with Zen practice. So the influence of Zen goes way beyond temple walls. It starts to reach into various classes of society. These folks may or may not be looking for a religion, but the influence of those teachings, aesthetics, is there. So there are a couple of overall patterns in what's happening in Buddhism at this point. So one is that each sect tends to focus on one practice as kind of the true way to liberation. So you're chanting Nembutsu, you're sitting Zazen, you're studying a particular text, you're probably focused on one kind of practice. It doesn't mean you don't do other practices, but there's one kind of centralized something that you're doing. So the other pattern is this felt need to mix and alter practices in order to be more popular with people, in order to have more patronage, versus the felt need to retire into the temple and keep the practice, you know, pure at the risk of maybe it goes away altogether because you don't have any support. So we've got this, you know, balancing act, right? Do we make these practices popular for people, and do we take them out, and do we try to make connections that encourage support for the temple, or do we retire into the temple, keep the practice pure? Maybe we don't have the support we need to go on. How do we balance these two things? So at the time that Dogen begins to practice and teach, Tendai and Shingon are the two most influential sects. So Shingon is focusing on esoteric teachings, right? These are secretly transmitted teachings, like Tantric Buddhism. They're emphasizing prayer rituals that are dedicated to guardian deities with some miraculous sorts of characteristics. Tendai includes both tantric and non-tantric practices. So thousands of monks living on Mount Hiei in huts or in temples, doing all kinds of practices, doing various academic studies. All but the highest positions within Tendai were held by people from aristocratic families, particularly, guess who? Fujiwaras. So it becomes, you know, when it becomes more and more difficult to hold power in the court, if you're a Fujiwara, you're a court official, you feel power slipping away, what do? You ordain and you go to a temple as the kind of next best thing, right? So regardless of whether or not you've got any real religious aspiration, you know, whether or not you're devoutly spiritual person, your life circumstance is such that power slipping away, next best thing is go be powerful in the temple, right? So temples become a bit of a refuge for that. Temples are competing with each other for patronage. They're offering various kind of magical prayers for the protection of salvation of the country or for the protection of powerful families. So there's a lot of enmeshment. There's a lot of, you know, trading off. There's a lot of mutual support happening at this point. So Mount Hiei also had one of the strongest armies. I mentioned monk armies. Well, Mount Hiei has one of the strongest armies of monk soldiers who go into battle with other monk armies, and they're burning down each other's temples. And you just think, how is this Buddhist practice? But this was the way things were happening. So the armies were holding frequent demonstrations in Kyoto. The armies were making demands on the imperial government. So there's less and less of a distinction between what we might call Buddhist law and secular law. Again, the enmeshment is pretty amazing. So, you know, within a temple, we've got some regulations and some precepts and some acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. But when the monk armies are going out to protest in the capital and demanding things of the government, it's like, who's in charge, right? How do we actually regulate behavior? So political power and wealth are increasing. Moral, ethical, religious life is in real trouble. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of mixing. It's not clear like where leadership is coming and what is religious life and are ethical things happening or not, right? So water is very muddy at this point. So I want to take a quick look at Dogen's biography. We're not going to get through it all in this lecture, which is really okay. But I think let's go ahead and make a start. I think we're going until 10:20, if I remember correctly. So yeah, let's make a start. So in the midst of all of this, all of these influences, all of this upheaval, all of this shifting and changing, Dogen is born in the year 1200. So Stephen Hine is an academic Dogen scholar. He says we can see Dogen's life as a set of 4 stages of about 12 years apiece. During each stage, Dogen works with and resolves a particular challenge to understanding the self, and then use that understanding to look at the Zen tradition and practice in a kind of a new way. So I'm going to use that structure to talk about Dogen's life. And again, the map on the back of the general outline shows like where he is in the stages of his life. So you can see the 4 stages there and how he's moving around. So that may help you to just sort of put a geographic context on what's happening. So the first period is the formative period. So this is the first 12 or 13 years of Dogen's life. And these 12 or 13 years are about his becoming a monk and experiencing his great doubt. So, of course, we know what that is. If we already have Buddha nature, why do we have to practice? This is the burning question for Dogen as a young monk. So, eventually, that's where we're going. So he's born, as I mentioned, into the Minamoto family, the same family as that first shogun. His father is Minamoto Michichika. His father dies when Dogen is 2. So he's already got some upheaval in his life. He's raised by a half-brother, Michitomo, who serves in the imperial court as a high-ranking official. So Dogen is exposed to aristocratic life and sort of the refinements that go with that from a very young age. So on his mother's side, he's related to the Fujiwaras, the imperial family. So he is right in this intersection. When I first learned this, I thought, what a position to be in. You've got the Minamotos on your father's side, you've got the Fujiwaras on your mother's side. You're right in the middle of that. I mean, that has to be difficult. He's really in the intersection of these 2 governments, right, with a parent on each side. So the Fujiwara, again, the emperor's family, they're kind of fading. Minamotos are the shogun's family. They're emerging as the powerful clan. Dogen is apparently one of 11 brothers or sisters, raised in this aristocratic atmosphere. His siblings are important people in the court. They hold court positions, so they have a certain amount of power and influence themselves. Everyone very well versed in literature, in aesthetics. There's a very refined atmosphere around these families. So, as evidence of Dogen's genius, he is supposed to have started composing poetry in Chinese at the age of 4. He started reading Confucian classics in Chinese at age 7 and read the whole Abhidharma Kosha at the age of 9. So, he was said to have read the entire Buddhist canon by the age of 14. So, as we'll see, people who compiled Dogen's biography in later years had reasons to want him to look as exceptional as possible. So, we can take that with a bit of a grain of salt. At any rate, he receives a very good education because the assumption is he's going to grow up and become a court noble like the rest of his family. So, of course, he needs education in the classics, in writing, in all of the subjects and topics that he would need to take on that role and live that life. But his mother dies when he's 7. So now both of his parents have died. At this point, he has this deep experience of impermanence. And some stories say he saw the incense smoke rising at his mother's funeral. He had this deep sort of insight into impermanence. Apparently before her death, his mother urged him to become a monk and to work to liberate beings. But at any rate, he decides at a young age, he's going to renounce society, he's going to ordain, going to be a monk, and that's going to be his path. So by the age of 12 or 14, he has already turned down a future as a noble. as a court official, as part of the aristocracy. He's been adopted by his uncle. The uncle didn't have an heir, and he wanted Dogen to take over for him. But instead, Dogen goes to another of his uncles who is a high-ranking Tendai monk in the whole Mount Hiei system. He asks to be ordained. As we know, Mount Hiei is the headquarters of the Tendai school. He's just 12 years old when he arrives. He's a low-ranking monk, but somehow already he has this burning question about Tendai teachings. As I study both the exoteric and the esoteric schools of Buddhism, they maintain that human beings are endowed with Dharma nature by birth. If this is the case, why did the Buddhas of all ages, undoubtedly in possession of enlightenment, find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in spiritual practice? So that's his great doubt. This is the burning question for him. So this is a question that comes from the Tendai teaching of Hongaku, or original enlightenment. So this says that all human beings are enlightened by nature. So the idea that we can practice in order to gain enlightenment is fundamentally problematic. Dogen couldn't find an answer on Mount Hiei. So not only that, he becomes disillusioned by what he sees around him there. There's internal politics, there's infighting, there's the need to be from a higher social class in order to advance somehow. He says, this is not for me. And he leaves to study with many other Dharma teachers, right? He's looking for an answer to his question, but also the atmosphere, the container, just doesn't feel right for him. So this is the end of the formative period. Now we move to what Heine has called the transformative period. So this is the stage from 1213 to 1227, roughly. So this encompasses this new religious path that Dogen starts on after he leaves Mount Hiei. This is where he meets his teacher, Nyojo, and he has his awakening experience in China. So that's the sort of high points of this period of his life. So he leaves Mount Hiei. He goes to visit another guy called Ko-in, who is the abbot of another Tendai temple, deeply engaged in esoteric practices. Ko-in is a follower of Honen, who started the Pure Land School. So Dogen asks him the same question about, if we already have enlightenment, if we already have awakening, why do we need to practice? Ko-in says in order to find an answer, he might want to consider studying in China. So now we see he's starting to be pointed toward this trip that he ultimately takes. He says, you might want to think about going to China and learning something about Chan. So we need to understand China's place in the world at the time, because that's an important part of his story. So in Asia, at this point, China is really the center of culture. It's the center of civilization. As we know, a significant part of Japanese written language is made up of Chinese characters. Japan gets some important literary forms from China. Of course, much of Japanese Buddhism is influenced by or originates in China. And as I mentioned, there's already this thriving trade between Japan and China. So China's influence on Japan and the rest of Asia is really huge. However, going to China is not an easy trip. That's a dangerous sea crossing. So you're in, imagine medieval Asia and the technology of medieval Asia. It's not an easy thing to decide to make a trip to China and to actually go there. So Ko-in tells Dogen his answers might be there, but it's not a given that he can just sort of up and go to China as the next step. So some scholars say that in 1214, Dogen goes to visit Eisai at Coinage. So you'll recall Eisai was the founder of Rinzai, considered the founder of Rinzai. So he goes to visit Eisai at Coinage, which is one of 3 temples that Eisai founded. And Eisai had been to China twice at that point and had transmission from a Chinese teacher. So again, we see these threads of Dogen's going to China. Because Tendai is suppressing all the new Buddhist movements, Eisai has to teach the conventional practices along with Zen. So he's doing a little bit of a syncretic kind of practice. We do know that in 1217, Dogen went to study at Coinage under Eisai's successor, Myozen. Myozen becomes an important teacher for him. Dogen stays there for 6 years until 1223. So we don't actually know whether Eisai and Dogen met. There's some controversy. That's kind of an open question. And we don't know really that much about Dogen's life at Coinage. We assume he received training in koan studies because that was the principal practice of Rinzai there. We do know that Zazen was also an important practice. So if he was doing koans, he was also doing Zazen. There's some chance that he met Eisai briefly, but Eisai's death dates are, we're not sure if they actually met. Dogen arrives in Coinage in 1217. Eisai dies in 1215. It's possible they met previously or at one of Eisai's other temples. But although that's an important connection in the Dogen story, we don't actually know if they physically were ever in the same place. But the important thing is that Dogen is exposed to Pure Land teachings from Koin and to Rinzai teachings from Eisai and Myozen, in addition to the Tendai teachings that he was receiving because he ordained at Mount Hiei. So look at all the many influences on him and the many things that he studied and was exposed to. He may have visited other teachers and temples as well because he's searching for this answer to this burning question. So there are many, many influences on him and many, many streams of practice. So when Myozen decides to go on a pilgrimage to China in 1223, Dogen gets to go along. So, Myozen is a well-respected Dharma teacher in Kyoto, but he felt that he really needed to deepen his own study. As well established as he was, as well respected as he was, he said, there's more I should learn, there's more I should do. He decides to follow his own teacher Eisai's example and go to China because he's looking to study authentic Zen or authentic Chan. So as I say, it's a dangerous trip by boat across the East China Sea. It's not something you do lightly. It's not something you do on an impulse. Ships didn't make that trip between China and Japan all that often. Sometimes it was several years between voyages. The trip itself took 2 months. So if you got on a ship in Japan, you were 2 months on that ship until you got to China. But finally, Dogen is getting to go to China. He's getting to study Chan as Koin had recommended. So what an opportunity. You really can't turn that down. So he and Myozen studied and practiced in one of the temples where Eisai had also studied and practiced. So they're following his footsteps a little bit. So it's a bit of a pilgrimage. So Dogen also visits various other Chan temples in China, as well as other teachers. Most of the practice at that time was based on koan study, which was something he was already familiar with. And he works hard to study these koans, but he didn't really like it. He's there studying koans, but he just thought there should be more sutra study. Somehow the balance just was not right. And again, he's thinking, this is not it. So one of the important things he learns about in China is the forms of monastic practice. And as we'll see later, this becomes one of the major thrusts of what he brings back to Japan. So for instance, he sees the robe chant for the first time, where you put the robe on your head and you do your chant. He sees it for the first time there. He's really inspired by that. This grounding in forms shows up later in his own practice, the way he conducts his own temples. When he establishes his own temples in Japan, it becomes a really important piece of what he's aspiring to do. So the training, the experience, the immersion that he gets in those monastic forms in China is huge. It's a huge influence for him. While he was there, he also saw and studied transmission documents. And usually these transmission documents are kept secret. So somehow he gains access to these. He gets to see them and look at them and study them. And he goes on to make authentic transmission a very important theme in his own teaching, as we see. Well, we will see when we get to themes. Authentic transmission is a big piece. So he was aware that people who weren't really qualified to receive transmission were trying to get it from famous teachers who were associated with the government. They were bribing officials to get temples to be installed as abbots. He's really disillusioned by all of this, right? All of this sort of power grabbing, which doesn't have anything to do with authentic practice, authentic awakening. He's just saying, people are buying and selling these things, and this is not for me either. So he's really discouraged. He's very disillusioned. He's ready to give up. He says, I'm done. I'm going back to Japan. Someone suggested, as he was thinking about getting ready to, somebody suggests in 1225 that he go see Tendo Nyojo. And the rest, as they say, is history, right? So Tendo Nyojo is the head of a Caodong lineage of Zen in Mount Tiantong. And he has this reputation for being a very strict but very genuine teacher. Someone who didn't take on new monks easily. You couldn't just show up there and say, please let me in. He's perfectly willing to throw out anybody who's not seriously practicing, who's not very wholeheartedly, diligently, devotedly practicing. He's also known for doing a style of Chan that's different from the other teachers that Dogen studied with. So Dogen goes there, and he likes this guy. He says, this is it. This is the teacher for me. I like the atmosphere. I like what's being taught here. He considered both Myozen and Tendo Nyojo to be really important teachers for him. So finally, he has found a place that he thinks he's going to get his question answered. He's still carrying his question, right? He finally thinks he's found a place that's going to help him get his question answered. And of course, while he's practicing with Tendo Nyojo, he has his awakening experience. So supposedly, again, these are the stories. Supposedly, Dogen has been there for 2 years without ever lying down to sleep. In other words, he slept in Zazen posture. This is the story. And he's heard Tendo Nyojo scolding other monks for sleeping during Zazen. And apparently, supposedly, his teacher says that Zen study requires casting off body and mind. Dogen hears this, and he has a breakthrough. He has his awakening experience. And of course, this phrase shows up throughout Dogen's writings, right? Shinjin Datsuraku, dropping off body and mind. So there is some disagreement today in academic circles about whether that's what Tendo Nyojo actually said, or if it's just what Dogen heard and he misunderstood the Chinese. We'll never know. But the importance of that is giving up your conscious effort to become Buddha is what happens in Zazen. And this is what sort of points him toward his answer to his great doubt. So Zazen and casting off body and mind is the complete manifestation of the awakening that's already present. Thus, we have to practice, right? So if there's no practice, awakening doesn't manifest. Now he understands. He's turned this thing on its head. So Myozen dies shortly after Dogen arrives at Mount Chentong in 1225. And in 1227, Dogen receives Dharma transmission from Tendo Nyojo. So his first teacher has died. He receives transmission from his second teacher. Finally, he has settled this life's quest of the great matter, his original question about Buddha nature. He goes back to Japan and brings back with him Myozen's remains. He feels like that's part of his duty, is to bring back his teacher's remains. So he's been in China. He's now returned to Japan. So Dogen's time in China is really important. So after studying 4 years, practicing there 4 years, he transmitted to Japan the Zen teachings and also the rituals and forms, the monastic container that he learned. So at that time, Zen was beginning to fade a bit on the Chinese mainland, but it's taking hold in Japan. So it's fading over here, but it's rising over here. And he is part of that movement to get Zen established in Japan. Because the shogun supports it, it's able to expand rapidly. And this rapid expansion means that in Dogen's view, the original teachings and practices are being lost. It's growing so quickly, it's becoming so popular that somehow it's deviating. The original pure sort of forms of these things are being lost. So his main purpose for going to China and spending all that time there was to get back to the original primary teachings of the Indian and the Chinese ancestors and to grab those things, absorb those things, bring them back to Japan. So Buddhism has been in Japan for 400 years before Dogen. It wasn't that he was bringing Buddhism to Japan or even bringing Zen over from China for the first time. He's bringing back what he sees as the essentials of Buddhism, right? The most pure essential form of Buddhism. So some of the things he brought back and established in Japan. Meditation conducted in the monks' hall. It used to be not so well organized. It was happening kind of anywhere and at any time. A new layout for temple design that featured the Dharma hall that replaced the Buddha hall. So we'll talk about those temple buildings and why that's important. For now, just know the design of the temple layout was important, and he changed that when he brought it back. Delivering sort of within this monastic compound various kinds of formal and informal sermons. We'll also break those down and look at that. An emphasis on the value of temple officers. Chief cook, we know about Tenzo Kyokan. We know about the rules for all the temple officers. So these seemingly kind of lower level, mundane, day-to-day temple officers, he says, no, that's critical. That's really important, both for supporting the temple and as a practice. So we see the emphasis there. And finally, the use of poetry to express these sort of inexpressible, fundamental, very basic teachings, especially during ceremonies and celebrations. So, you know, if it's a day of observance, somehow he's likely to come out with a 4-line verse because he's using the poetry. Because as we recall, this is his training, right? He's got this aristocratic training. He knows how to write poetry, and as we will see, he does it very, very well. All right, I think that's a reasonable place to stop for today, or for now, to see if anybody has questions, things you want to bring up, connections you want to talk about, things that weren't clear. And I have to say, I can't see you well enough to call on you, so please just open your mic and say what you need to say, and we're going to try to not step on each other. Does anybody have something to say or ask at this point?
Hi, Hoko. This is Mark. I've got a question to ask you.
Okay.
What's the difference? I've never been able to really understand this. What's the difference between esoteric and exoteric Buddhism?
Well, it has to do with, are the teachings secret? And are they transmitted, say, from master to disciple in a very secret way? So that you have to have particular training, or you have to have particular qualifications or credentials or background or something, so that it's not something which is broadly shared, as opposed to these kinds of practices that we were talking about for common people, that it's not a secret, anybody can learn it, anybody can talk about it, anybody can engage in it. So I think with the esoteric practices, my feeling is, and somebody may know more about this than I, my feeling is it's kind of like certain people with very specialized powers or skills do these things on behalf of something, on behalf of the family, on behalf of the government, on behalf of the nation, right? So it's like I have powers somehow to save other people or protect other people, as opposed to practices which anybody can engage in and practice for themselves and see, if it's a results-oriented practice, see a result for yourself, right? So it's the difference between being secret and passed down in a very secret way, and kind of being open and available to everybody in a nutshell. Does that make sense?
Yep. So then the corollary to that would be, what's Tantric Buddhism?
Well, I'm going to ask you to investigate that one on your own. It's a kind of esoteric Buddhism, and we don't have time to go down that rabbit hole, so I'm going to ask you to just sort of investigate that yourself, but just know it falls kind of under that category in some ways. So yeah, I mean, it goes back to Indian practice. It's not Japanese alone. They're quite old practices, and there's plenty of information out there that you can read up about that. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you. Other questions, follow-ups, things folks would like to know about?
Yoko, this is Fusats. Again, thank you for the reference. I think the historical view is very important to kind of structure things on what influenced him related to what was going on, around him. Very similar dynamic here. We're kind of seeing the parallels to the now, right? With people being pushed out based on what was going on in the societal to really evolve their practices and teachings. Can you say just a little bit more about that? We saw the transforming into the new Buddhist sects emerging out of that. So I think that the social environment of the time really informed the push to evolve the practice, and you can clearly see that in what you were speaking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think you're living in an age where everything around you is going to fall apart, it's the age of declining Dharma, and you see you're surrounded by social unrest, and you're not sure whether your crops are going to grow, whether you can feed your family, whether someone's going to take your land, whether you're going to be conscripted to go off to war, clearly you're looking for some kind of ability to predict and control your environment. And in the human condition, sometimes that means religion. If there is something you can put your hands around and call religion, because of course in many cases religion and the rest of life are not seen as separate. It's just this is the way the world works, right? So certainly if we're seeing shifts in who holds power, who holds influence, if I'm somebody who holds influence, I'm afraid of that influence going away. Therefore, I'm looking for a way to predict and control. If I'm a simple person who makes shoes for a living, I'm feeling very much like I have no power and no control. And again, I'm looking for a way to predict and control what's going on. So you can see both of these sides, right, are looking for something. It's like, somebody please, what can I rely on? Because so much is unreliable. So talk about impermanence, right? I mean, no wonder this becomes important. It's important to the aristocracy from an aesthetic point of view. Oh, the leaves fell off the trees. Oh, my teacup broke. But for somebody, you know, who isn't sure they're going to have a farm the next day, boy, impermanence is a big thing, right? So I think overall, what it feels like to me is there's just this mad scramble from every direction to get a foothold. You know, all the things that I have in my life that have been predictable and going along and not changing very much, suddenly, oh my gosh, you know, somebody took the box and shook it. I mean, one of the things we know is we just look sort of at the pattern of Japanese history is things will go along for long periods of time without a whole lot of change. And then suddenly something happens, and then everything, you know, gets up in the air. It's the same thing, actually, that Uchiyama Roshi is dealing with in his questions about peace and progress, because, of course, he saw Japanese culture. You know, he's born something like 1912, I want to say. He sees Japanese culture has been going along fairly serenely. Everyone's got enough to eat, so they're not worried about making big strides in agriculture. Energy is really going into sort of refining the aesthetic life. And then along comes, you know, world wars, and along comes World War II. And suddenly here comes all of this influence from the West. And again, everything is thrown up in the air, and he's just going, you know, how do we maintain some kind of stability and equanimity and recognize that change is happening, and how do we manage change? So I think this is part of the human condition. We go along, we're feeling pretty comfortable. Something blows up, you know, what do? We start looking for, in some cases, spiritual practice. So it makes a lot of sense to me that the old traditions don't die, you know, they hang on, but the new ones are springing up. And now how do they figure out how to coexist, right? And as we're going to see throughout the rest of Dogen's life, they don't coexist easily. They're figuring out how these things are all going to sort of occupy the same cultural space is a real challenge. So as you say, I think having some understanding about the world into which Dogen is born and the situations in which he's developing his practice really help us understand some things about what he has to say later on. So we're not by any means done with this. This afternoon, we have the whole rest of his life to see how this continues to play out. Is that enough for you, Satsu? Is there anything else?
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, I'm good.
All right. Anybody else with questions, reflections, things you want to know?
This is Mokashin. I'm just
Hi.
wondering, the statement about Dogen didn't see himself as creating a new sect. So is he like Isai in a way in that he's going to quote unquote reform / save Zen? Was that his mindset, or?
I think he's bigger. I think he's thinking bigger than that. I think he thinks he's going to reform / save Buddhism. I don't even think he necessarily sees that. So we're going to come back to this when we talk about the themes of his practice, because over and over and over we see this unity of Buddhism. Over and over we see he doesn't even differentiate between Theravada, Mahayana, any of the vehicles. He just says there's just this one unified Buddhism. So when he goes back to China, he's not necessarily looking for Chan. He's not actually necessarily looking for Tentai. He's looking for Buddhism, right? My guess is if he could have gone back to India and found where they were practicing, he would have done that, right? So he's trying to go backwards to find, you know, in a world where there's so much competition for patronage and sects are trying to survive and temples are trying to just earn enough money and all of this. He's going, in the midst of all of that, like, have we lost our way? If nobody can answer my question about why we're practicing, doesn't that kind of mean we've lost our way? So I think he's going back to try, you know, he's looking for the answer for his question, but I think he's also sort of peeling back and saying, underneath that practice in a way, thinking like, what is that, right? So when he's not talking about Soto, I don't think he's even talking about Zen or Chan or Tentai. I think he sees Buddhism as one unified thing, and that's what he's trying to save. So it'll come around again, and please follow up at that point if you have more things to say about that. Is that okay for you?
Yeah,
all right.
Great.
Other questions? Things people would like to offer this morning?
I have one sort of comment related to sort of the historical context. So there was a Japanese historian, I don't know why the thing's not switching over to me, sorry. he was Toshio Kuroda, and he sort of, this is in the 20th century, and he reformed some of the kind of existing ideas about Japanese history. And one of them, and you sort of alluded to this, and I think that all your sources are probably informed by this theory, but I think it might just help to sort of tie some things together, is that, instead of like, okay, so the emperor, like the emperor's power ends and then the shogun becomes like the most powerful person. What he said instead was that there was this, what he called the gates of power system. So there are 3 gates of power, which are the, the court, nobility, the military, and the temples. And all 3 of these groups are always kind of jockeying for power and trading power and so forth. And this goes on from, before the Kamakura era for, several hundred years after. And I think the important piece here is just how much power the temples had, and in the context of Dogen, because I think that that's one of the main things that he's reacting to. He talks a lot about how, monks should be humble and poor, and in reality, they're holding as much power as, the shogun in reality. So I think that that's a really important piece to sort of understand what Dogen was reforming, because, we talk about like corruption, I guess, in the Buddhist schools, but really, I mean, the temples were, almost as powerful as the government. So I just thought I'd add that.
Good, thank you for that. Yes, so it's nice to have have a resident academic here to pull the pieces together. Yes, thank you for that. So as I say, these are themes that are going to show up again and again and again this week, and so it's good to have that preview and have those 3 points so we kind of know where to hang things, right? That's really helpful. So yeah, we've got governments, we've got temples, we've got the emperor, we've got the shoguns, we've got the temples. And as I say, so much shifting back and forth, up and down. Somebody's in power and then they're not, it's somebody else. It's kind of crazy. So, for our purposes, having a broad overview is helpful, but you may want to, on your own, do some investigating about the rest of this context and the kinds of things that Dojo is bringing up, because it really helps us to understand, as I say, why is Dogen emphasizing this? Why is he going off on a rant about that? If we don't know what he's responding to, we make mistakes about how centralized certain things are in his practice. So yeah, the whole piece about corruption is a big deal. Temples are very, very powerful. They have land, they have patronage. And as we know, somehow, although Dogen is uncomfortable with all of that, when he goes to establish Eiheiji, guess what? He's got to find some patronage. He's got to be in touch with somebody who can help him to do this thing. So he's walking that fine line, and he always, it seems to me like he always feels really uncomfortable. It's like, I need this, but I really hate it. So, I mean, that's the human condition, right? So very good. Thanks, Dojo. And of course, please jump in anytime you've got clarifications and things to add. All right. Very good. Other questions, comments this morning? Things to raise?
I think Sawyer had a question.
Oh, Sawyer.
I do. You saw me leaning in. Thank you. Yeah, and with my folks here, cozy on this winter day. My question is you were talking about how these new sects of Buddhism were arising as people were everyday common people were kind of looking for something to do meaningfully, and Zazen as being one of those things that anyone can do. But then it also seems like there's some feeling, or a lot of feeling in Dogen's writing about Zazen is sort of for monks, for home leavers, rather than just sort of anybody out in the world like most of us. So I wonder what your or Dogen's thoughts are on that.
Well, one of the things that we see very quickly about Dogen is that his thinking shifts over time. So the reality of sects arising, 3 kinds of sects arising, that are either chanting Nembutsu or sitting Zazen or reading the names of sutras, is something larger than Dogen. So in the midst of that, once he gets his temple established, once he figures out what kind of practice he's going to want to be doing, at the end of his life, he does tend to put a greater emphasis on monastic practice. But I think what's important is he's not saying that lay people can't or shouldn't do Zazen. He's saying the monastic container, it's not the people, it's the container, a monastic container is the best way to manifest awakening, right? So again, we're going to come back to that before the end because it's one of his themes. This whole monastic container thing is one of his themes. So, in the larger scheme of Buddhism at the time, it is possible for anybody to learn to take the posture and to sit down. You don't have to have secret teachings. You don't have to have magical powers. Anybody can sit down and, do what we do in Zazen. So that's why it gets, it's part of that movement and it's part of that practice. But, of course, Dogen continues to refine his thinking and his understanding about Zazen, right? So, he comes back from China. One of the first things we're going to see is he comes back from China. What's the first thing he does? He writes something called Fukanza Zengi, the universal recommendation for Zazen. He's saying everybody should sit Zazen. And we see in his writings, he says men, women, children, dogs, and cats and stones can have, have awakening. So it's not like that's not achievable. But it is true that toward the end of his life, he tends to focus more on a more strict monastic container, and there are particular reasons he does that. So hold on to that paradox. And when we get to those points, if you want to bring that up again and talk about it some more, we can do that. At that point, you'll have a little more information about the context for that. But I'm really pleased to see people making connections because this is exactly what I'm hoping folks will do. I think this is where the juice is. Oh, there's this thing, and then there's that thing, and like, how do they, right? So that's why Zazen is a practice for the common people, if you will, because anybody can do it. But the circumstances under which it happens can change. Is that okay for now? I think you've raised an interesting question, so let's not lose sight of it. Other things folks would like to bring up?
I think it is important to note, though, that common people never did Zazen
Yes.
until the 20th century, basically.
Yes.
And among the Kamakura New Buddhism people, Dogen was probably the most. I think rhetorically, it was kind of like open to anyone, but in practice, all the people practicing with him were really highborn, fancy guys.
Yes.
Unlike, Ippen and Nichiren and Shinran, who really were kind of practicing with common people.
Right. Absolutely true. And of course, if you're running a business, if you're farming your fields, you do not have time to sit home all day sitting Zazen. You have things to do. So thank you for that, because I meant to make that point and forgot to. The reality of the average person sitting a lot of Zazen, probably not. But technically, anybody could sit down and do it without sort of magical powers. So yeah, thank you for that clarification. That's really important.
I have a quick comment.
Hi, Sagan.
Isn't it true that some years after Dogen, that Keizan sort of made an effort to try to widen the audience? In other words, kind of make Zazen practice available or known to a wider public?
He absolutely did. And unfortunately, we don't have time this weekend to talk about Keizan. He's going to come up very briefly in the next day or two. And in fact, I have to say at that point, we don't have time to talk about Keizan. But yes, so he's considered, if Dogen is considered the mother of Soto, the father of Soto Zen, Keizan is considered the mother of Soto Zen because he had a lot to do with spreading it, making it popular, making it accessible for people. You're absolutely right about that. So again, that's something people, if you want to read up on Keizan Jokey, he's an important ancestor for us.
But again, there, I would just say that I don't think Keizan really popularized Zazen with people. He popularized the Soto Shu by additional, actually sort of esoteric practices that were available to common people that normally wouldn't be.
Right, right. He added all kinds of really interesting, really kind of interesting things. But yes, it's important to differentiate between the sect, the denomination, and the actual practice. Very true. Okay.
I wanted to make a comment. I don't.
Sure.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
So how important is actually availability of a teacher to that idea of monastic container being the only correct way to go? Because there were no teachers otherwise.
Well, as we'll see, Dogen had lay people sometimes practicing with him. It was possible as a lay person sometimes to practice with the monks, to attend services, to attend lectures in particular. But certainly if you were the average person sort of living your life, running your business, farming your fields, you may or may not ever encounter a teacher. And then, yes, it would be very difficult to learn to sit. So I think as Doju pointed out, often the people that are learning from Dogen, the people in the temples are the people with a bit of higher class, higher status, and who can make themselves available for that kind of thing. So, you know, I would say probably for most people who encounter Buddhism, they're not encountering it through a teacher teaching them to sit zazen. They're encountering it through stories, through miracle tales, through picture tales. There were, you know, folks who went around with pictures and explained the pictures because people couldn't read, right? So they would tell the story by explaining the pictures. There were, you know, reasons that temples had festivals. There were reasons that, you know, plays were put on, because that was a way to reach people with teachings. It was not necessarily about sitting zazen, though, right? It might be about ethical teachings, or it might be, you know, something useful that the Buddha said. But the primary thing there was not, we're going to go out and teach people to sit zazen, right? So it gets shared in different ways. Yeah, for us today, we think, I want to go learn to sit meditation somewhere, right? Not what was happening in Japan at the time. Okay, I've got 10:40. I think it's probably time to take a little break, let things settle, let you all have a bit of a stand up and move around. So we'll pick it up here at this afternoon's talk. And in the meantime, I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin. He can lead our outgoing chants. We'll take a bit of a break, and we'll come back for a period of zazen before lunch. Okay? Thank you, everybody.